Hi, I'm Lori Jones, President and CEO of Avasec Communications and host of StrategyCast. Join me and my guests, innovators, disruptors, and visionaries as we explore bold and brave marketing strategies that help you transform, scale, and grow your brand. I'm excited to welcome Geoffrey Colon, a guru in disruptive marketing. Our conversation covers a lot of ground, including why even the most innovative tech companies need to rethink their communication strategies to connect genuinely with audiences. Jeff reveals insights from his latest book and shares practical tips on using storytelling and creative content to carve out a space in competitive markets. Whether you're looking to revamp your branding or need to find new ways to engage with your audience, today's discussion is packed with actionable advice. Stay tuned as we explore how to merge creativity with strategy to make your brand unforgettable. And don't forget to check out the most recent issue of the StrategyCast newsletter on StrategyCast.com. Just like this episode, it's full of inspiration and a ton of ideas that will elevate your strategies and marketing know-how.
A competitive edge starts with strategy, and strategy starts with knowing how to develop one. StrategyCast is a leading marketing podcast that serves up strategic insights, trends, and tips to help separate your business from the pack. Tune in weekly as host Lori Jones interviews bold marketing leaders who have priceless wisdom and are willing to share. Each episode explores cutting-edge approaches that have proven instrumental in transforming brands into industry trailblazers.
Welcome to StrategyCast. I am so excited to have Geoffrey Colon join the show today. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lori. Good to see you again.
This is your second appearance. We are so lucky to have you. First of all, tell us a little bit about your background. And then, although the book has been in the market for a while, I do want to tee up disruptive marketing. Tell us a little bit about the book as well.
Yeah, no, I've been busy the last couple of years in and out of big company environments, consulting environments. I mean, you name it, I sort of have done it. I think the last 4 years, it's been really interesting in business. I mean, I don't have to tell the listeners this. It's just been, a whirlwind of like growth and activity, then pullback, then growth and activity, then pullback. It almost feels like a seesaw. But I'm leading a new boutique agency, heavy on B2B, heavy on creative B2B. So it's going to be exciting to sort of see what we do in the space.
Yeah, it sure is. And we're going to be talking today. The theme is disruptive tech companies are missing the boat because they aren't speaking a language people can relate to, something that is near and dear to my heart. And obviously, I know that it's something that's very important to you as well. Talk to us about disruption. What was the premise behind the book? And you really, I believe, we've been talking about disruption in marketing for many, 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 many years. But you were really one of the forethought leaders when it came to providing very specific strategies on how you become disruptive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing when I got the idea for the book and said, hey, I want to write this was, the web had been flourishing for some time. Digital marketing had pretty much been, it had become the norm, Lori, at a lot of, companies, large and small, in terms of how to reach customers. One of the things that I sort of saw was, hey, most of the technology we're using is going to continue to evolve and change. And even though I didn't call it, artificial intelligence in the book, or even, really talk about AI in the book, I was talking about automation and how that really helps change what we do, both on the side of reaching customers as well as how you scale, a small company to actually behave like a large company, or a large company to behave like a small company. It just depends on what, companies are trying to do and who they're trying to reach. But, at the end of all of this, I mean, really my thesis is, we have access to a lot of different tools, a lot of ways that can help us change how we reach people. And, the web as we know it isn't really going away. I mean, it will continue to evolve. In some respects, it might actually become more difficult because of the fact you have generative AI everywhere. And, it's like, are you reaching real people? Are you just reaching other AIs to make those decisions? That's a whole other debate unto itself. But, I just sort of saw where things were going. And I just felt like, hey, someone needs to write a book on this because I don't think we're, marching backwards anytime soon into a full analog world.
Do you have any books or a sequel on the docket?
I've always talked about writing another one and taking sort of a 180, which is how do you do really more sustainable marketing? Disruptive marketing, the thesis is, hey, here's what's going to change. Here's how you adapt. Now I feel like if I were to write a book, it would be, hey, here's how to sort of prosper moving forward. A lot of companies, I think, have a hard time getting comfortable doing lots of the same things over and over again. What we see from econometric data is that actually works. If you actually continue sort of establishing yourself in the market and saying, hey, we're going to keep doing the same things that we're doing, it might feel boring to you or us, but it actually works over time because it takes time, space and time. It's like physics to really reach the audiences that you want. And even if you do reach audiences, this is a big thing we see in B2B. It doesn't mean they're going to buy right now. I mean, like you might be a person who's like, okay, we do need a new software system in this area. That doesn't mean you have the budget to buy that, but that doesn't mean that you stop marketing to those people. Because when they do come into market, Lori, you want them to think of you as the default. And they're like, oh, hey, this is the solution we want. Let's go talk to them. They've been sort of marketing to us the last couple of years. And now we're in market to actually go and purchase that solution.
I cannot agree with you more. And to let everyone know, at the end of the show, we're going to share with you how 10 lucky listeners can get a free signed copy of Jeff's book. So listen in toward the end of the show and we'll provide you details on that. Let's dive into really the crux of the show today. Why is it that so many brands are leading with what they do and how they do it instead of really why what they're doing is disruptive and why people should care about it?
Yeah, I think there's the interesting stat that I've been reading as of late is, you've had sort of a change over the last 20 years. Let's go back to like 2004, if we rewind. The web as we know it is, it exists. We have search engines, we have browsers, we have different ways of finding information. We still have our people networks, we have social media, we have streaming networks. So you have more connected devices. We have a tendency of forgetting about this, Lori, when we talk about sort of disruption is everyone's like, oh, hey, here's how I'm going to reach everyone online. And the big question now is, okay, how are you reaching them on, a television that might be in their living room that's connected to the internet? And a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? It's like, listen, most devices are connected now or moving in that direction. And that allows the ability of marketers to figure out how to reach people. So I think the big thing that I keep saying to a number of folks is, how are you evolving and sort of staying relevant as more of these systems that people sort of gather on continue to gain steam in the sense that most of us find information online? How are you basically, defaulting in those areas? How are you adapting to where search might be going? And the B2B space, it's quite interesting because you have a lot of companies that are like, well, everything starts with sort of a search, but search as we know it is sort of, it's pivoting to a new area where, you're going to have more chat interfaces. Now, I say that as we speak in 2024, that's not a high amount of people who use those interfaces, but this sort of reminds me of any new technology. Right. Ultimately, it moves in that direction and you have something that becomes sort of the norm. So we have to think about how we adapt to these things. Most of my discussions now are, how are you making authoritative content that speaks to those chat search interfaces that ultimately will be mainstream in the next 3 to 5 years? A lot of people look at me like I have two heads because they're like, what are you talking about? We make content on our website and that defaults in terms of the search. But Lori, that's not where search is headed. So it really requires a lot of unlearning and relearning new things in the space all the time. I think, curiosity seekers do quite well in
Yeah,
our world.
it is a constant evolution. And let's not forget that 95% of B2B buyers have their decision made before they actually call up the brand or interface with a human being or a chat bot. A chat is in there probably pre 95%, but nonetheless. So, with that in mind, going at it incorrectly or going at it too vertically and not casting a wide enough a net within the funnel to make sure that you're adapting to precisely what someone is looking for and asking for and how you can then educate them is really where the big mistake happens. And getting to the why and understanding what it is that's going to intrigue that person and excite them, inform them about wanting to learn more and move through the funnel is a real trap of not going at it correctly from, the top down.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. Most people know already, they already have gathered all that information because they have all of this information available to them. So they've already done sort of all the research to your point. And yet we still sort of think about, well, how are we going to market to them when they actually already arrive at our doorstep to ask a number of questions? What we should be thinking about is, hey, what are the questions they're going to have for us that we can answer that help them get closer to, the finish line. It's an interesting study. We did some research while I was at Dell where we realized most of the marketing materials we have don't need to be on a website because someone, to your point, Lori, they've already made that decision. The last thing they want is more marketing materials when they end up on the website. They want more information on, hey, how did this help someone solve a problem? So that was the content we sort of over indexed on.
It's the relatability of that. When you can put a prospect into the shoes of someone who's already utilizing the product, it makes that, first of all, it normalizes them. It makes them feel as though, okay, here's a good brief or a good case study on what this brand has done. It's very similar to what I'm experienced with maybe a couple different things, but it really helps them understand, it's the human touch that we talk about so often when it comes to marketing.
Yep. I would agree with that 100%. Yeah.
So what are some of the human-centric approaches that brands are missing as they're moving people through the marketing channels that you would advise that they really dive into and concentrate on more?
Well, I think the interesting thing, and you brought this up, and it's a good one, is too many companies I see when someone is interfacing for the first time with them, let's say on a website, they automatically are like, hey, would you like to talk to someone? And that I find is really bothersome to a lot of people who are actually just gathering information.
Yeah.
What we should try to do is figure out if someone has visited for, in an environment where they have to, like, let's say, log in and register, if they're there for, like, let's say the fifth or sixth time, that's when you ask them, hey, what can we help you with? Like, we see that you're a returning visitor. What questions do you have? That initial discussion sort of reminds me of retail environments. And I think we can learn a lot from, real sort of environments that involve people. When you walk into a retail store, one of the things most people don't want is someone coming up to them right away and asking, do you need help? Because they're actually trying to navigate the store. They're like, well, I don't know what I need yet. I'm just looking around. It's better after a person has sort of done what they need to do. They've been in an environment for a while to then go up and say, hey, could I help you with anything? Most likely they're going to say, actually, yes, because I've had time to look around and I'm looking for this. That's sort of what we need more of in most of these sort of what I would say customer experience environments. These are a lot of the discussions that I think keep a lot of people in UX up at night because they're sort of trying to figure out what's the best balance. But you have people who are like, we need to actually drive the business. Let's sort of be as aggressive as possible. But that can blow back in a lot of companies, face.
And what's disturbing as a marketer in a lot of these situations is, yes, you want that balance. You want to be able to explore and understand as a visitor to the site, as a potential buyer, explore and self-educate in a very, very private manner, to make yourself feel smart. But all too often, there's so much jargon and tech speak used in a very, very mundane, simplistic product that people don't understand what it is that you do and what you're selling. So you lose them top of funnel because the engineers or the product team is driving the message instead of the marketing team.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing there too is we have to remember that there are a number of different people involved in any buying scenario when it comes to especially tech, like technical products. It isn't just, I think we've believed the myth that it's just the IT department or it's just the chief technical officer. I have to be honest, having worked on the inside of these bigger companies, those people don't evaluate much of anything. They're usually at the end of the decision making in terms of, hey, team, what do we have that are like the 4 things we might want to go with? Then they're weighing in. But we've over-indexed, Lori, into thinking we have to target the chief technical officer. That's the person making the decision. It's like, no, you should actually be thinking of all the people who influence the chief technical officer at a company, which includes marketers, because marketers are usually working with the IT department on where they want to go and the needs of the business. So I think we've almost hyper targeted too much in B2B, where we need to sort of open up a little bit more and realize there may be 5 or 6 different types of folks at the table deciding in terms of procurement where they need to go with acquisition.
Well, and you can certainly, fine-tune messaging deeper in the funnel, but it's fine-tuned too tightly or too vertically at the awareness stage. And that's what's causing a lot of the issues. That they're not going broad enough from general awareness standpoint to get these diverse audiences interested in learning more or traveling down. And and yes, to your point, some of them do enter bottom of the funnel. The information better be correct for them. If it's a referral through an internal source, to get the details that they need to help make that buying decision. It is very, very complex. Where do you see most, especially when it comes to the messaging, most funnel mistakes taking place?
Yeah, I think one of them is, if you're a product-led company, which a lot of software as a service companies are, the mistake there is that they lead with product and there's nothing wrong with this, Lori, but they lead as they continue to grow. And once they get to a certain run rate, it's like, hey, you need to actually start marketing yourself as a larger brand, not a product solution. And they're always like, but this is how we got here. We got here by marketing our product. And it's like, yeah, but you have let's say you have a $200 million in revenue now.
Right.
You're actually expanding. You need to start thinking a little bit more of, hey, where's our pivot? What are our brand colors? What is our logo? What is our tagline? All the simple things that we might laugh at because we're like, well, wait, that's branding. We don't really need to do that in product-led growth companies. It's like, but you do if you want to actually continue to expand and become more of a household name in these industries. That's where I think the biggest mistakes are made is when companies get to certain scale, they're afraid to actually turn on the hyperjet and go into the stratosphere. They're like, oh, well, let's just remain a product-led company. And it's like, that's where you're going to remain because you're only, speaking to a niche audience. You need to expand and speak to larger audiences. I always give the example of, why did certain companies expand in some areas over others? Like, let's say in the cloud, because you had a number of people who knew what those, even if they didn't know, let's say, Amazon Web Services, they knew who Amazon was because it had expanded its brand into a number of areas. So you could have a CMO saying, I know who that company is. I mean, when we're talking like 15 years ago. So those are things that product-led groups have to think about. Like, look at the bigger companies and look at when they turned the jet thrusters on to actually become more, scaled. The other big problem is when companies actually scale before most people know who they are. That's when they blame marketing. They're like, hey, this isn't working.
And we see that a lot with SaaS. I think hardware, is more product led. And then, like a Dell, you ultimately really need to make sure that the brand is strong downstream. But with a lot of SaaS solutions, they go broad too quickly and they don't have, one or two of their modules fully embraced and known by the market, and they have no idea what it is that they're buying. Or
Yeah.
or they're isolating things too tightly, and people, again, it's like, what is it that you're selling?
Yeah. That's a big one. I think, and you bring up that's a great question that a company should continue to ask themselves at least once every, you know, year, twice a year, depending on their sales cycle. Like, hey, what is it that we're selling?
Right.
Like what, because ultimately I think a lot of companies get lost there. And then and when they answer that question, they're like, oh, well, we're selling this. And what do they give you? A list of features. And it's like, no, that's not how people buy. They buy based on, a solution. Hey, I use you to solve for X, Y, and Z at my company. Those are the bigger questions that companies need to ask, I think, before they get into an existential crisis.
It's interesting. I'm interested on your opinion on this in the marketing world. So once marketing takes over, I see a lot of creative teams getting so cute with their messages that it totally disrupts what there's no sales impetus. It could be highly creative, but I still to this day, with very, very, very seasoned creative directors, have to look at them and say, what are we selling here?
Yep.
I mean,
I love that.
yeah, and we have to retool until we, present something to the client. And again, it's great creative, but what are we selling? We've totally lost it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, like being in the creative world, like a lot of creative directors will get, to your point, Lori, a little too cute or a little too, hey, look how interesting this is. And it's like, wait, that's a little too out there for who the end audience might be. And I'm all for doing things that are radically different to draw attention or mental availability. But, sometimes it goes so far out there that you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't come back to the core of what this business is about. You can do interesting things, but try to keep whatever that core sort of, message is. That's why I always think like when you work on visual ID systems, and people get paid a lot to do this, when you think about brands, you really should think of like, what is our tagline for our company? Because that helps center you. And a lot of times people think that's a useless exercise. We don't need to do that. But I remember talking to like the head of brand at Microsoft when I was there, and he's like, "Oh, I had to come up with the new tagline for the company. Satya Nadella, the CEO, wanted a new tagline, and ultimately that helps center the company. It's how do we empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more? That every time you're making a product there, what the focus is. That I think is missing at a lot of companies, because they sort of say, well, we don't need these cute things. We don't need something like that. But it's like, I think that will bring a lot of creative directors. That centers a lot of creative directors. If you can say like, hey, does this really accomplish the mission of what we're trying to do as a company? And if a creative director goes, well, what is the mission? And someone goes, well, let me explain it to you in a paragraph. That doesn't work, Lori. We need simplified ways of sort of figuring out how to stay, centered and focused.
Well, we have 6 seconds to stop someone, number one. It could be even shorter based on the media type and where you are. And we need to speak at a second grade level.
Yeah.
All gets lost if it takes too much time to be able to think through that. I want to. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the second grade level thing is absolutely hilarious, because we've done research. I've done research in the past in a number of places where they would come back and say, this is written at a PhD level. And I'm like, okay, what's the problem with that? They're like, well, here's your audience that's going to understand that. Mm-hmm. It's like, you should really be writing, at the 7th grader level. And they would show examples. And in a lot of ways, when you're, you have a lot of people who are highly intelligent at these companies. They're like, no, we don't want to do that. But they have to understand, it's like, hey, that is going to help us get to where we need to go. Otherwise, we stay within a niche core audience, and we then are going to wonder why we're not growing, over, year over year.
Back to what we talked about at the onset of the discussion, and that is awareness stage. because
Yeah.
people get too technical at that stage, they lose the entire, many, many different audiences and influencers that they have along the way. I want to change gears for a minute. In our pre-show discussion, we had a wonderful chat about narrative economics and how it relates to word of mouth. Explain that concept to us.
Yeah, so there's two things that the listening audience should check out if they want better, like really good examples on this. One is a book by Robert Schiller, who's a professor out of Princeton, called Narrative Economics. Came out a couple of years ago, and he sort of explained when you seed narratives out into the marketplace, these are stories that people pick up on, and that's what people hook into, and that drives sort of awareness over a period of time. In fact, some of the best ones really drive markets if you think about it. The other example is a movie called Dumb Money, which came out last year. This was about the guy who basically invested in GameStop stock and drove the stock upwards and got people to invest in it. That was all based on narrative economics, Lori. What it really is, and I'm not saying, of course, use it in that way to the listening audience, but these are good examples of how you get a narrative out there to get people to take action is really key to almost doing everything in this day and age. This is why CEOs go on business shows to talk about, hey, we have this new feature in
Right.
our software and it does X, Y, and Z. Some are better storytellers than others, but this is really the basis of almost how everything works in our economy. And I would say this isn't even new. I think what's new is that information spreads a lot quicker and it's more democratized and we can see it everywhere. But I think narrative economics goes back to even an era, 100 years ago where things were a lot slower, or you had to wait for the morning newspaper to come out. And we weren't digitally connected. There are still stories people told to sort of help drive a narrative. And I think the better marketers get this, understand how to seed a marketplace, understand how to dominate, people talking about particular products because they've understood sort of, how to drive these narratives compared to some other people who are like, hey, let's go out and just talk about these features or talk about something else here or run a bunch of advertising. Those are all good tactics. But, at the end of the day, people really are connected to good stories. And that's what, gets a lot of them driving those stories for you. Before you know it, you don't even have to say anything because a good narrative is just driven by other users out there who are like, yeah, this is the company and here's why that has X, Y, and Z. And we use it all the time.
And
And it helps us, meet all our goals.
right. And seemingly you'd think, okay, where does this narrative belong from an execution standpoint? And you'd think, okay, earned media and shared. But really, the truth is that it needs to be across all channels. And it might start from the head of the body down. The CEO might be on Squawk Box or something like that, talking about a new product. But it starts there. But maintaining that narrative throughout the entire funnel. And then ultimately, even, your internal salespeople, external salespeople, on the trade show floor, just reiterating that time and time and time again, the output is that the customer then begins to talk about it that way and believe it so that they're ingrained with the product and then they become a referral source for you as well.
Yeah, that's and that's really when it's working is when if you look at the long tail of how most narrative economics works, you're talking about something, it's released out into the environment, customers start to use it, and then before you know it, customers are basically providing testimonials without even having to be asked. And then you're able to use a lot of those testimonials as social proof. And we know, Lori, that we're all social animals. We sort of, we like to be part of a larger herd, so to speak. And that's why then people start to adapt to these narratives because they'll say, wait a minute, I want to know how that's going to help my business. Let me go explore more of that. This is sort of how we see lots of companies really, grow to become sort of forces to be reckoned with because ultimately they get lots of their own sort of customer base to act as that word of mouth for them. And they don't have to pay them to do that because they become so rabid about it. I think, there's only, there's only so many companies that can say they do this really, really well, but there's tons of examples of companies who've tried to use this over the past, decade or so in particular lines of business to, sort of help these stories drive growth.
I love it. A couple questions for you regarding it. The first one is the timing. So we know that it takes, especially with a new brand, 2 or 3 years for the brand foothold to really, really take place, for people to be able to recall it in their own mind without necessarily having to see an ad or a message. That's a pretty long time period. I would guess that the narrative economics just helps shorten that cycle if done correctly.
I would say that's why a lot of companies use it, because it will shorten that cycle. It also will do, to your point, it will help, to your point, drive a lot of, let's say, paid media. Let's say you go out there with paid media alone. I think it's effective, but it's not as effective if you say, let's go out and drive a narrative and then have paid media on top of it, which then also helps with earned media. There's a model we call like POE, or paid, owned, earned, that people have gotten away from for some reason, in the last couple of years, that really does work. Like most companies that sort of buy into it, it really helps drive growth for them. And for some reason, we've gotten away from it. Either we've said, hey, let's just over index on owned. So that's when you have companies that are really good with what they do on their own website, their own channels, but they don't do any paid, and they don't do any earned. They're
Right.
always wondering why are we not getting as much traffic as we did at one time? So they run into growth problems. Then you have companies that over index on just earned.
Right.
And these are companies that are social first. They do a good job in sort of social media. They drive a narrative, but I call them sort of like clout chasers. Nobody knows who they are as a brand because they're always trying to gain attention in a particular area. And so then, they always wonder why, hey, how come we're not getting a lot of traffic and growth as well? Then you have companies that over-index on paid, like they spend a lot of money there, but they never go out and talk very much. They don't drive any narrative. There's no earned. They might not have much owned. Like you have to really, I think, balance all of these. If there's three of them, you have to have 33.33%
Yeah.
indexing in all areas to be, really running on all cylinders. And that's easier said than done. I mean, I'm saying this saying like, oh, all you have to do is this and it's easy. I think the hard thing is that companies are like, well, we don't have a lot of money in paid, so let's just over index in these two areas. But I
They
think
need it,
the
though.
better companies, are
Yeah.
balanced in that respect.
You've just defined the peso model, the paid, earned, shared, and owned approach. We call it OSEP, owned, shared, earned, and paid. Um,
Nice.
we feel that is the stronger way to be able to really entrench the brand from a believability and authenticity way. In most situations, our paid backs up the OSE at the front of it, which really you just described in a beautiful way, not knowing what our model was. The other issue, back to the narrative and the timing associated with it, I think people have the tendency to change the narrative too quickly because it isn't taking, a foothold, or it doesn't have immediate traction. It takes time. What advice do you have for our listeners today regarding that, somewhat of a supposition there?
Yeah. These are great questions. I think the issue most companies have is they're in annual operational planning cycles. What are we going to do this year? Here's the budget. What do we do? And what do we track quarter by quarter? I'm not one for 5-year plans, but I think if you get into a company, and this is why we've seen CMO tenure be too short. CMOs, whenever they come into a company, should really tell CEOs, hey, how long do you plan to be here? Most CEOs will say, hey, I plan to be here for a while. And what CMOs should say is, yeah, me too. And here's my 5-year plan, and it requires buy-in. And this is how we're going to drive the business. And this is how it's going to make sense over, let's say, a 2, 3, or 5-year period. Because to your point, even if the products change and evolve, a company needs to establish what it's there for with a narrative. So even if you're like, and we've seen this with a lot of companies the past couple of years, oh, hey, we're introducing more AI into our products. that shouldn't change what their narrative is in terms of their sense of being and what they provide for, basically their customer base. That should change. We've gotten away from a lot of this for some silly reason. I don't know why, where we don't want to establish long-term growth goals for companies, or how we actually look at the past and say, look at these companies that were big titans in the industry. How long did it take them to get there? Most of them, I would say it took them 2 decades to get where they are. There's just so much financial pressure now to get to where you need to go at a smaller pace. What I'd love to see more of, and I think we may see it in sort of this, higher interest rate environment, is more companies saying, look, we're in this for the long haul. Here's what we're going to do to get there, because we're not going to get overnight growth. We don't have 0 interest rates to borrow a bunch of cash. We have to really drive our business the old fashioned way. It almost reminds me of how businesses were run almost in, sort of in like the post-depression era. You were like, how are we going to sustain this? Right. So, it goes back to like you asking me the question earlier, what would you write if you wrote a second book? Hey, how do you sustain a business, based on sort of all the things that are out there? Because that we've gotten away from a lot of that, because we sort of have looked and said the entire environment's disruptive. I'm going to use that as a smokescreen to sort of cover myself at a company. What I think bolder visionaries will say is, this is what we're going to go do, and this is what we're going to drive, and this is the narrative, and we're going to continue to repeat that narrative everywhere we go for the next 5 years. That's really what's missing out there right now, Lori.
You started out talking about, the CMO asking the CEO how long you're going to be there, so that they can work together. And it struck me while you were saying that the first thing a marketing team, a CMO wants to do when they enter a new company is make their own mark. And
That's right.
what they do is they change the campaign. They change the narrative, which I think impacts growth on so many different levels. Because I mean, the average tenure of a CMO is 2 to 3 years. Why is that? Is it because they're not adapting what was done before and it should stay, and they don't need to make their own mark? Is it because everything is constantly changing? Is it product? Is it ego? I mean, all these things come into play that really does affect, even the mindset towards marketers in general.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're at a period right now, especially with the sort of the job environment, where, many are questioning, do we even need marketing? The thing that's interesting is, ask that question, let's say 2 years from now, because I think the data will show a lot of these companies are going to suffer heavily, because we have, again, past historical data that shows whenever you turn marketing off, it's not something you see right away, Lori. It's usually like 3 to 4 quarters later, and where people start to go, what's going on? Why are we not growing? Well, you turned all these systems off. How do you expect to basically be seen, heard, or noted by any of the customers that we want out there? And you're starting to see more and more of this. Companies will say, we don't need that. And then they realize quickly, wait a minute, we do need that. But it's not as easy as turning a light switch on and off. I think during the pandemic, a lot of companies got sort of, what would you say, like complacent. They're like, oh, we grew a ton and we didn't have to spend a lot in marketing. That was a different circumstance. You may have grown because people actually needed your solution because they were changing their entire behavior. Now that behavior sort of reverted back to the norm, what are you doing again to capture this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Before we leave, you've got this really interesting point in your book, and you talk about, and you're very bullish about it, I might say as well. You talk about the move from an information economy to a creative economy. Are we there? And how does this impact tech and B2B companies in general? And explain the concept too, if you will.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is most companies are, especially in B2B, haven't really put an emphasis on their creative per se. They've put more of an emphasis on their targeting, their audience targeting.
Right.
And that emphasis is now, there's now starting to realize, wait a minute, the targeting isn't as important as the creative, because when if the creative's good and it shows up in front of an audience, that audience actually responds. And more companies now are realizing, hold on, we have been doing this all wrong. We've been putting a huge emphasis on the audience we need to be in front of, but we've been dropping stuff that looks absolutely terrible. It's not inspiring. It's not emotional. It doesn't get people excited. I think what's interesting is we're going back to an era that existed around 40 years ago, where the most creative companies actually were B2B companies. And I say this remembering Sunday morning news talk shows, Lori. I'm dating myself here. Every ad that we saw during that period of time was a B2B company, and they were highly creative.
Right.
Very interesting in terms of like what they were doing. Now, we live in a different era where we don't necessarily watch TV ads for these companies, but I do think a lot of B2B companies that approach things in a creative manner in terms of, hey, let's go after our audience in ways that our competitors are not doing. Let's get them excited about things. Let's actually reach them as real people making real decisions, understand their pain points, do things that are fun, do things that are interesting. I think like that's where we're seeing a lot more. Like I would love to see a company that really wants to reach developers do things like game shows on social media. Because every developer I've ever met is like a unique geek that loves games. Like, and I'm not trying to stereotype, but it's true. And I think like they want more of that type of like marketing that's happening instead of, oh yeah, there's an ebook I can read. That'll be important for me to gather information. But like, it doesn't help you stand out from the marketplace.
Well, and to that point, Avocet actually developed an ebook on the creative resurgence and the need for more creativity when it comes to marketing. And what we believe is that so many people, with the quickness of digital advertising and marketing and turning a post around in 2 hours and an ad around in 24 hours or 6 hours, that the need for highly creative and provocative and evocative approaches to getting someone to stop and look and read and listen, whatever it might be, was pushed aside. And we have seen the need for more creative as an agency owner, and as our clients, we've seen the need for more creative, but the investment along with it hasn't necessarily followed. Where do you see all of that friction coming together and basically leveling off and to your point, driving the need for higher creative budgets in the future?
Yeah, I think, most of it will go through sort of a pattern where, companies just won't really get the results they had been getting for a very long period of time because, digital marketing was one of these areas that anyone could tap into. Some companies cornered that market, but now it's like you're just one of many companies that are doing that. To your point, Lori, like how do you sort of stand out in those spaces is going to be the big question to ask. And that's why I think, I don't think we're there yet, going back to your question prior, but I think we're headed toward more of a, creative revolution, by design, just because some companies will realize this is the way forward for us to just gain more traction. All it takes is one or two companies doing something that's very unique. And a lot of, again, going back to sort of the herd mentality, everyone else then follows and says, wait a minute, how do we one up this? How do we actually stay relevant in some of these areas? I think a lot of companies have rested on their laurels of, well, we're feeding these sort of systems with, content and information. It doesn't necessarily mean that anyone finds that, interesting. I think it takes probably, 2 years of companies to realize this isn't working for them to sort of change their ways, or someone in the market pushing them in that direction by just saying, we're going to do something drastically different. There are many SaaS companies that I talk to that are like, they're chomping at the bit to just do stuff very different. I do think that'll happen as we move into, the next year, mid-decade, because a lot of these companies will realize like we're just not going to sort of follow all the rules that everybody told us to follow. And that's when it gets interesting.
It's none of this is easy. Actually, it's really tough. There's so many balls up in the air. If you were a CEO today, knowing that the economy is changing so much, Where would you double down?
I would start to ask questions on why we don't put so much emphasis on creative people who help, companies reach others, and why we've over-indexed in areas that, are sort of what I would say bureaucratic. Like a lot of companies, Lori, are filled with people who don't make anything, don't really do much of anything. Um, they just sort of provide support, or, they're basically, doing process. I think what's kept us, away from what's interesting is we sort of moved in this direction where we're like, well, let's replace all the creative people at a company because that's easier with all the sort of tools. But I still think like there's a need for that type of high level thinking at companies. And if I were a CEO, I'd be like, hey, who's in my room that is going to help us get to a place that other companies are not going to get to? I mean, when you run a company, you're assembling a team. It's almost like playing a sport. And you're like, who are the people that can help us get to where we need to go? And, when you think of like a sport like basketball, it's a strong tie sport, meaning if you have a team with like really good like one or two really good players on the court, you're going to dominate, even if you have weaker players because they rise to that occasion. Yet I think like you have to get some better creative folks around CEOs for them to understand like this is the world we're in now. It's a content first world. This is how people basically pay attention to things. And this is how we're going to sort of win the market with our narrative. I think if you just go back to like, we're going to run things the way they've always been run because, we don't want to get in trouble with regulation. And this is just sort of how we've built the business. That's where I just sort of wonder, like, do you have the right leadership in place for where things are going?
Yeah. And like a good bottle of wine, creative just gets better with time. We find that with our own agency relationships that we've got great ideas out of the chute, and we're talking strategy ideas and execution ideas and creative ideas. Great ideas, but as you get to know the brand better and the people and the audiences and you interact, you just get better. The ideas get better and better and better. So with that, Geoffrey, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show today. I loved our time together. What is the best way for our audience to get in contact with you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so if you want to connect or reach out to me there, I'm happy to communicate. I try to answer sort of all the messages people send to me there.
That's great. And it's Geoffrey with a GEO, not JEF. So remember,
Correct.
yes.
Correct.
And for those of you, please, Jeff's going to give out books. He's going to give out his books on disruptive marketing. So the first 10 people that email me, Lori at StrategyCast.com, I'm going to forward those details to Jeff. He's going to sign a copy of the book and he's going to mail it to you. So how cool is that, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And hopefully the listeners who get one, maybe gain some insight from it. Not everything's correct in the book, but hopefully it gets you to maybe open up your mind and think a little bit more.
That's all we can ask, is that it gets people thinking, that curiosity. That's so valuable. Jeff, again, thank you so much for your appearance on StrategyCast. And you can get a hold of me at Lori at StrategyCast.com, as I just said. And don't forget to sign up for the StrategyCast newsletter as well at StrategyCast.com. Jeff, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on today's show. We hope your strategic brains are spinning with new ideas and bold inspiration that will elevate your strategies and marketing know-how.